Sealed with a Loving Kiss. Written by Ellie Dean. Read by Annie Aldington. The moral right of the author has been asserted. Chapter 1. Cliffehaven, 1942. Peggy Reilly was restless after her long, intimate talk with young Mary Jones, and she lay awake, staring into the darkness, thinking of the tangled web of lies and secrets that she must keep to herself. It had been imperative to dissuade Mary from continuing to ask about Cyril Fielding, for the truth, if told, would cause lasting hurt, not only to little Mary, but to others who'd been innocently drawn into Tommy Findlay's deception. And yet she'd hated the subterfuge, for it went against her open and honest nature, and she knew how easily lies could be uncovered. And when they were, they inevitably brought more hurt than ever. Her thoughts whirled, and she eventually became impatient with them. There was nothing more she could do except keep an eye on the girl, and make sure there was no further trouble from Tommy Findlay, for Mary was determined to stay in Cliffehaven, and she would have been deeply suspicious if Peggy had forced the issue and tried to persuade her to go back to Sussex. She climbed out of bed. Pulling her old dressing gown over her long winceyette nightdress, she put on her slippers and quietly checked on Daisy before she left the room. Her baby was almost a year old now, born on the terrible day that Pearl Harbor had been destroyed and Malaya had been invaded. But she could sleep through anything, and was thriving despite the restrictions of rationing, the noise of air raids, and the absence of most of her family. Beachview boarding house was silent but for the occasional creak and groan from the Victorian timbers, and Peggy closed the kitchen door before turning on the light. The kettle was always left filled in case there was a bombing raid and the water supply was cut off, so she placed it on the hob of her kitchen range and waited for it to boil. She had lived at Beachview for most of her 43 years, and it was so much a part of her that she couldn't imagine living anywhere else. Her parents had started the boarding house business shortly after the railway line had reached Cliffehaven, and the popularity of seaside holidays soared. When they had retired, Peggy and her husband Jim had taken over and raised their family here. The day trippers and holiday makers had stopped coming once war had been declared, and so Peggy had decided that to make ends meet she would have to take in permanent lodgers. But the war had brought huge changes to Peggy's family, for they were now scattered to the four winds, and she rarely saw them. She regarded the photographs with longing, for they were lined up on the mantelpiece below the framed picture of the King and Queen. Jim looked handsome in his army uniform, the twinkle in his dark Irish eyes undimmed as he gazed back at her. He'd been called up, and was on his way to India now, and she was waiting impatiently for his next airgraph. Her two young sons, Charlie and Bob, were down in Somerset on a friend's farm with her eldest daughter Anne, who'd recently had her second baby. Peggy had yet to see Emily Jane, and little Rose Margaret would be changing so fast that she was probably unrecognisable from the toddler she'd said goodbye to all those months ago. There was a photograph of Anne and her husband, Commander Martin Black, who looked very handsome in his RAF uniform, but she knew how Anne worried about him. Even though he was flying a desk now, he'd done more than his share of sorties over enemy territory. Their enforced separation had come shortly after Rose Margaret had been born, and Peggy knew just how deeply they both suffered from it. The photograph of Sissy, her middle daughter, showed a laughing, fair-haired girl of 21 in a WAF uniform. She'd once had dreams of joining ENSA and becoming famous like Vera Lynn, but thankfully she'd grown out of such silliness and had settled down very nicely at Cliff Aerodrome, where she drove an Air Vice-Marshal about. Peggy gave a sigh as she ran her fingers through her dark curls. Sissy was in love with Randolph Stevens, a young American bomber pilot, but there were almost continuous raids over Germany now, and too many of those brave young boys had not made it home. As Sissy had already lost several friends to this terrible war, Peggy fretted that her daughter would suffer even more heartache should anything happen to Randy. Unwilling to dwell on such dark thoughts, Peggy looked at the small black-and-white snapshot of the lovely girls who were lodged with her at Beachview boarding house.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?